Yeah, quite straightforward really. So I did a law degree at Birmingham University and then I went straight on and did my PhD there in 3 years, which now looking back seems quite quick considering there was lots of empirical work. And then I came to Warwick originally as a research fellow on a big ESRC project that came out of my PhD. And then I got a lectureship and then have very, very happily remained here since. So I've been here for a very long time. I think as I say, very happily. I think it's a really nice place to work. Feels very international, very diverse. Gives you space to do what you want to do. In terms of why I went into academia, really, oddly, as an undergraduate, I was sitting in a socio-legal seminar class, and somebody talked about when they interviewed the Home Secretary, and they were incorporating that into the lecture and the research, and I just thought, how interesting, you get to go out and interview these people, you're not just reading a case or an article. And so I went up to him afterwards and said, so how did that happen? You know, how did you get into that? And he said, well, you have to do a PhD, which at that point, I'm not from an academic background, I'm the first person in my family to go to university. I thought PhDs were just for science students. I didn't even know you could do a PhD in law. And so that's how I then got into it, put my name forward, and was really fortunate that I got the scholarship. Otherwise I wouldn't have been able to do it. And did some research on the work of criminal defence lawyers, which then turned into a really major body of work and one that I brought to Warwick. So I've got a couple of things on the go, I guess. So the comparative criminal justice is probably the thing I've made my name with. And what inspired me to go into that is I'd done this work on criminal defence lawyers that I mentioned before. Criminal justice, miscarriages of justice was very much my interest. I'd done some work for the Royal Commission on Criminal Justice that was set up after the Birmingham Six had been released and so on. So I was really interested in models of justice and how things could be better. And I thought, I was looking at Italy, I was looking at France, but I speak French, so that was the obvious place. And so I went off, got some research leave and lived in France for 6 months and started doing some work, and have continued doing comparative work, primarily looking at French criminal justice and UK, but then also more widely into other European jurisdictions as well. So that's one strand of work. And within that, I've done work on defence rights, work for the EU on directives, work on the role of prosecutors. There's a bunch of other things that we probably haven't got time to talk about those as well, but the other thing that I'm doing at the moment is a completely new area for me that I've just been doing over the last 2 years, which is looking at police culture and community, which really comes out of West Midlands Police's partnership with Coventry UK City of Culture Trust. And as we know, trust in the police is pretty well rock bottom at the moment, and has been for some time. And so West Midlands Police kind of came up with the idea that why not try and use a partnership with the City of Culture to engage with seldom heard communities through arts and culture, so that kind of creative collaboration might be a way of actually building relationships, building more empathetic understanding, and then ultimately further down the line as a way of building up that trust. So that was really quite radical, what they did. You know, no one's really done that before. The police have engaged through sporting mega events and things, but not really through culture. So I've carried on with that work, and we've done some other evaluation of projects. We worked with the Belgrade Theatre. We commissioned a fantastic piece of theatre after Preston, which showed at the Belgrade last December. And now we've got another project with the Belgrade where we're going into schools and really exploring some of the themes that have come out in the research and that came out in the process of developing that play, exploring those themes with young people in some schools in Coventry. That's the plan. And again, using arts and culture, using a new body of theatre that's coming on at the Belgrade as a kind of a jumping off point, as a little bit of a provocation for those young people to think about things like policing, to think about what keeps them safe, what makes them safe, who deserves to be safe, and so on. So those are the sort of things I've been doing at the moment. I think one thing that students respond really well to is when you're talking about your own research, particularly if it's empirical research and sort of on the ground. So when it's quite hard sometimes for students to get their head around comparative criminal justice, a whole different system, different judges, different lawyers and so on. And so if you say, well, when I was at the police station, this happened or that happened, you can give them actual examples of cases, and I think it really brings it to life for them. So I think that's something I enjoy doing, and I get very good feedback from students about that. I think also just giving like little problems, if I'm like when I was teaching criminal law and kind of trying to introduce quite complex concepts. So you just think, well, what is intention? What is negligence? What is responsibility? And then just giving them often quite silly, flippant examples. And then saying, so what do you think? So I'm walking down through the lecture theatre with a big pile of papers, and I trip and I fall and I bash into Charlotte, and then she's dead on the floor. Am I responsible? You know, but, oh my gosh, no, it seemed an accident. Well, what's Charlotte's mum going to think? She's going to, and so you work it through. And what's interesting is the students nearly always identify what those key points of tension are. And essentially they realise they've then gone through that thought process. So when I then say, well, here's what the Court of Appeal or the Supreme Court said, they've already thought about that. And then they realise this isn't so scary. These are just ordinary factual circumstances that we have to kind of navigate our way through. Well, for me, I guess I tend to do, well, pretty well all my work is empirical work. And so really it's about moving away from the law in books as an aspiration, as a kind of rhetorical account of law, and thinking about what happens on the ground. So that's very much what law in context has meant in my own research. So an example would be my early work with criminal defence lawyers, when Section 58 of PACE introduced the right to a lawyer for all suspects in police custody, and people thought, great, that's sorted, everyone has a lawyer, so now we can attenuate the right to silence or do all of these other things. But actually, our research showed that not everybody did have a lawyer, and even when they did have a lawyer, they weren't a lawyer, it was somebody who was wearing a suit, carrying a briefcase, had the card, but actually perhaps had no legal qualifications or no experience and so on. And that was really important because obviously the right to a defence is a really important fair trial right. And if the accused isn't getting that, then the whole thing is just not working as it should do. And so that's a really great example of how lots of arguments were made at the time about, in a sense, almost how because one right had been given to the accused, other rights could be taken away. So it was really important to understand how effective that right was. And that's really inspired a whole body of work in my comparative work, in my EU criminal justice work. I've done 2 major sort of multi-country studies around that, around basically effective defence rights. So that would be one example of law in context, I guess, in my own work. Yeah, so I'm starting to think about bringing psychology into my work a little bit more. It seems a real natural companion, I think, for law. And so one of the ways I'm doing that is with co-supervised PhDs. So a couple of years ago, I co-supervised a PhD student in psychology who was looking at police disclosure of evidence reviews. I now have a PhD student who I'm the first supervisor, second supervisor's in psychology, and she's looking at the right to custodial legal advice for suspects in Scotland, and in particular thinking about how that might work and how that might be effective in relation to vulnerable suspects. And so our notion of vulnerability and how legal safeguards might map onto that in ways that are quite effective, I think psychology's got quite a lot to say about that. And then conversely, I'm co-supervising another psychology student who's looking at credibility assessments in asylum tribunals. So that's quite interesting, bringing in my own kind of models of evidence and understanding credibility through different models of justice and so on, but for, again, a psychology student. Yeah, I think so. Last year I set up a new research cluster in the law school, Arts, Culture and Law. And for me that's a really interesting emerging theme, that lots of us are working with playwrights, with creative writers, spoken word, sculptors, There was something on the radio this morning about the Prima Facie play that Jodie Comer was in that is now, they're going to write that as a book, and they were talking about how that's already influenced lawyers and judges in thinking about how they might conduct rape trials, how they might give instructions to the jury and so on. And so in the same way I was talking about policing and that collaboration through the arts, that's led me to really think about actually how arts and culture can really play a part in different ways in our research, in the way that we connect with perhaps more marginalised communities. So, rather than me going into a school and saying, hello, tell me about your experiences of policing, tell me about this, blah, blah, blah. If we go in and we maybe have an extract from a play, or we work with young people to make a film about knife crime, that's often a much more productive way that gives people kind of quite a safe space to open up a dialogue and a discussion, rather than just in those sort of much more traditional ways. So I think that link between arts, culture and law, or justice or social justice, is becoming a theme that's more and more important, and I'm starting to make lots more connections around the university in that space.